Dear friends, welcome in a new episode of Top Talk. Today our guest is renowned expert Richard Giragosian, director of the Yerevan-based Regional Studies Center. Richard, thanks for finding time for this interview.
Thank you.
While we have a lot of intriguing topics to discuss as the processes develop so fast and so interestingly in this part of the world, we decided to focus more on the Armenia-Turkey normalization process. Richard, both countries, Armenia and Turkey, were very close to civil rapprochement back in 2008 and 2009 during the so-called football diplomacy and the Zurich protocols. You closely observed and in some cases even participated in that process. You are also monitoring what is happening now between the two capitals. I'm sure you have a clear understanding and some insights about the present attempts to normalize the ties between the two countries. Certainly this time the geopolitical setting is totally different with the end, first of all, with the end of the Karabakh saga. We might add different other factors to this setting as well. I would be intrigued to hear your thoughts, your understanding, your comparison of these two processes, mainly the differences for both countries and advantages and disadvantages, please.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity. If we look closely at the outlook for Armenia-Turkey normalization, it is significant to start at the beginning. The football diplomacy of 2008-2009, that was a significant engagement diplomatically between Armenia and Turkey that resulted in the actual signing of two diplomatic protocols. One on reopening the border and a second separate protocol on establishing diplomatic relations. However, that process and preliminary engagement failed. Nevertheless, the current outlook for Armenia-Turkey normalization benefits from two advantages. First, obviously, the new geopolitical landscape has dramatically changed, offering a new opportunity for both Armenia and Turkey, as well as Armenia and Azerbaijan, to normalize relations. The second distinct advantage is also in terms of lessons learned from the earlier round of football diplomacy. For the Armenian side, the only issue in Armenian foreign policy that continued without change from the previous government was normalizing relations with Turkey. It is the rare exception, and it's based on a policy of no preconditions and looking to the future rather than the past. What we do now see, having been to Turkey 3 times in the past 16 months, is a fresh opening, a new opportunity. What the Turkish government is candid and sincere about is informing the Armenian government that Turkey cannot and will not do anything to undermine its position with Azerbaijan. That is a given. Nevertheless, Azerbaijan today, unlike football diplomacy, remains willing to see where this goes as part of a larger peace treaty and agreements with Armenia in the post-war situation. And if we look going forward, there are 2 recent developments giving us optimism. First was the reopening of the border during so-called earthquake diplomacy, allowing Armenia to provide much needed humanitarian aid. And second, a significant upgrade to the border crossing facilities, preparing for the day the border reopens.
I see. Richard, you just mentioned about the earthquake diplomacy. That was a huge thing. Last year in February, when the border opened, for many people, it was a symbolic gesture that the borders became unsealed after so many years. And I remember your article back then for an Armenian media outlet, and your conclusion started with the following sentence: the combination of a sudden diplomatic breakthrough and opportunity from earthquake diplomacy offers a genuine opening progress. And the title of this writing is Heightened Momentum for Armenia-Turkey Normalization. Do you still believe the momentum which was built around the earthquake diplomacy still lasts until today, or it is already gone? And do you also still believe that the Armenia-Turkish normalization can serve as a game changer for our region, South Caucasus?
Very good questions. First, if we look back at the so-called earthquake diplomacy, that was a rather significant, if not sudden, breakthrough. And what was interesting was the fact that the Armenian government was preparing for such diplomatic opportunities in the event of a natural disaster. Stockpiling, preparing supplies, not just necessary in the case of earthquake, but any natural disaster. Interestingly, these plans and preparations were also intended to allow Armenia to offer such humanitarian assistance to Azerbaijan if necessary, as well as to Turkey. The second interesting part of this was Turkey's reception. They reopened the border twice in order to allow this transit by road. And what was interesting was the most popular element of the Armenian assistance was not the humanitarian aid. It was the dispatch of emergency rescue personnel, which Armenian rescue personnel actually saved lives of Turkish citizens. This also resulted in a tremendous improvement in the image of Armenia within Turkish society and Turkish media. It also contributed to making Armenia and normalization much less of a sensitive topic in Turkish politics. But much of that momentum, after Turkey then resealed the closed border, much of that momentum was lost naturally because Armenia's priority was then Azerbaijan in post-war negotiations. However, momentum is returning since April, since the breakthrough diplomatic agreement over border demarcation that was reached on April 9th. In this new context, where Armenia and Azerbaijan are moving quickly to conclude a peace treaty and continue negotiations over connectivity, border demarcation, we do expect this momentum to bear fruit in the coming months. The reason, justifiably, for the optimism is also based on two new developments. The Turkish Foreign Ministry has elevated the one Armenian diplomat serving in Turkey as part of the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization. The Turkish Foreign Ministry held a high-level meeting with this Armenian diplomat, somewhat elevating his standing, but it was also a publicized meeting, which was very important. The second new development was an inspection of the Armenian border facilities at the Armenian-Turkish border crossing point. This was an inspection and tour by Armenian officials with one and only one guest, the head of the EU delegation. The Russians were not invited, the Russians were not involved. I think this is also a sign of the potential of Armenia-Turkey normalization being a very significant potential game changer.
Richard, thank you so much. You rightly mentioned that we are having two separate but pretty much interlinked processes It's Armenia-Azerbaijan on the one hand and Armenia-Turkey on the other. Sometimes it feels, and perhaps there is a grain of truth in this narrative, that for Armenia, the bigger prize is Turkey, not Azerbaijan, but Yerevan just feels obliged to somehow find a common language with Azerbaijan in order to then somehow mend the relations with Turkey, because as you just said, Baku still has a say in the Armenia-Turkish process as well. Do you also see this way, or you can still differentiate these two processes, and for Yerevan, both of them are important?
Yes and no. From an Armenian perspective, we do see what I call a twin track of diplomacy. Armenia-Turkey normalization, which started much earlier, and Armenia-Azerbaijan diplomacy negotiations, which is much more in this new post-war reality. Both tracks move at very different speeds and never at the same time. In other words, Armenia-Turkey normalization moves faster after some progress between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but it's always a parallel, indirect relationship or synergy. For Armenia, I would argue Armenia-Turkey normalization, opening the border, is very important to overcome isolation and actually the economics as well as the geopolitical significance. For Armenia-Azerbaijan, I would argue, however, post-war restoration of trade and transport, road and rail through southern Armenia, connecting Azerbaijan to the exclave of Nakhchivan, also offers important economic benefits for Armenia to become more of a transit state. The other reason I'm so in favor of both processes is the fact that economic interdependence is the most effective way to regain deterrence and to actually prevent renewed hostilities in the future.
Okay. Well, this is really interesting, Richard. Let me also turn to Armenian domestic politics. Well, it's not fully domestic, but still, you will understand what I imply. While the current Pashinyan government in Yerevan seems quite determined, committed to normalize the ties with both Azerbaijan and Turkey, we cannot diminish the importance, or cannot ignore the factors of other important players in the Armenian cause, such as the diaspora and church. So we're not speaking about Azerbaijan, it is not our subject today, but how would you portray the role of these two actors in the Armenian realm for this process? Will they eventually accept this as something normal, or will they do their best to derail the process?
This is an innovative question. If we look specifically, I would argue that Armenia-Turkey normalization, the real shock, the emotion, the powerful reaction against normalization by the diaspora was years ago during the football diplomacy of the previous government. The worst is over. People in Armenia, in terms of accepting a state-centric view, have become accustomed, if not advocating, normalization with Turkey. Secondly, for Armenia's engagement of Turkey diplomatically, the most important aspect was it returned the initiative in Armenian foreign policy to Yerevan, not the diaspora. And I do think the Armenian government has the upper hand and is actually engaged in a degree of statesmanship, shaping public opinion, not becoming a prisoner of public opinion, either in Armenia or within the diaspora. The second interesting observation is this particular Armenian government was re-elected in early elections after losing a war of 2020. That was an impressive achievement. It also was the second back-to-back free and fair election in Armenia, which means the Armenian democratic system, the country, is endowed with a rare commodity of legitimacy. These democratic credentials also means that today's government is much more self-confident and has the ability for concession and compromise after years of missed opportunities.
I see. Richard, can we speak a little bit also about more about some technicalities? According to your knowledge, what are the current issues on the table in the Armenian-Turkish dialogue? What do the parties discuss in terms of next steps? Do they prepare for some joint activities or regulations for transboundary work? What is your insight about that?
Well, what we see is a very different approach in contrast to earlier football diplomacy rounds. This time, the diplomatic focus is much more practical and much more specific. It's limited to two and only two issues: reopening the border, or more specifically, opening border crossing points, and then also the restoration of rail and road traffic, which is also related to the Azerbaijani connectivity. And the second specific objective, establishing diplomatic relations. As envisioned, the diplomatic relations will be from Tbilisi, Georgia. In other words, there will not be an opening of a Turkish embassy in Armenia per se. Initially, it will be an accredited Turkish ambassador sitting in Tbilisi, similar to some European countries. And I think this is much more practical and reasonable. The new elements of this, some are happening, some need to be addressed. What's happening is much more of a focus on regional economic development and trade between Armenia and the Kurdish east of Turkey, which is rather impoverished. Yerevan is the largest urban center east of Gaziantep. There is a comparative advantage regionally. The second element of this is actually meeting the need for Turkish national security, counterterrorism, where Turkey's response to the PKK, to the Kurdish insurgency, will be also a response about jobs and economic stability from an open border with Armenia. That's very important for also gaining constituents in Turkey from the so-called deep state, from the military and national security establishment. It's also something the Turkish foreign minister is greatly interested in, given his own experience and background. What needs to be done, I would argue, is something that needs to be done with Azerbaijan. We need to lift the cyber blockade. We need to lift the blockade of internet access between Armenia and Turkey, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Any justification for this cyber blockade has long passed. And as important as people-to-people contact is, we also need to address the infrastructural blockades beyond just the closed border.
It's very interesting. Richard, last but not least, regarding Armenia-Azerbaijan, many very optimistic voices speculate or claim that we might receive some tangible product by the end of this year in the form of peace deal or an interim peace agreement. What do you think would be, again, in terms of very concrete, very tangible issue about Armenia-Turkey process? What is the immediate fruit of this process, and when do you think we can expect that?
Well, what we see is, again, the relationship between the other track of diplomacy, Armenia-Azerbaijan with Armenia-Turkey. And what I'm pointing to is Armenian-Azerbaijani diplomacy is now sustaining a new momentum. the April 19th border demarcation agreement, renewed negotiations over road and rail connectivity, and now discussions over the 9th draft of a bilateral peace treaty, all of which are aimed at concluding by November. So I do think there's a coming looming opportunity. The challenge is both Turkey and Armenia need to be ready for this opening and opportunity. We cannot afford to miss yet another opportunity. And I do think the most tangible benefits are the most practical. Reopening the border, trade, economic activity on the local level will make the most difference in the ordinary citizens' lives. And second, Armenia-Turkey border reopening, railway connectivity in particular, is also a follow-up from the Armenian-Azerbaijani negotiations over the restoration of road and rail through southern Armenia to Nakhchivan and on to Turkey.
Richard, that was super interesting. I appreciate your thoughts and your time.
Thank you.